First, just want to thank this amazing group of panelists for joining me today to talk about this really important topic. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves briefly, I think, as part of our first question. I think we're going to start with something basic related to this topic. So as I'm sure everyone in this room is well familiar with, the term next generation is used flexibly and in many different contexts, especially as relates to student success and student advising. And so I think first question for you all, and maybe Derrick, I'll start with you and we can work our way back down, is what does the term next generation mean in the context of student advising and student success within your organization from your perspective?
Thank you, Sarah, for the great question. My name is Derrick Anderson. I'm a professor at Arizona State University, and I'm also the University Managing Director of University Design Initiatives. In its most simple form, the most sort of parsimonious operationalization of the term, I would say a next generation advising technology is one that uses scale as an asset, uses scale to its advantage.
That was brief and very clear. Thanks, Derrick. I'm Drew. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Mainstay, formerly AdmitHub. We use conversational AI to support people through college and career. And I would say next gen is really the fulfillment of the promises that have been made for the past 2 or 3 decades around personalization and supporting students, and also the realization that technology alone is never the answer. It's always got to be a purpose-built solution that combines the best that people and technology have to offer. Thanks, Sarah.
I'm Jennie Sanders, Vice President of Faculty Experience and Academic Services at Western Governors University. And building on the great comments from Derrick and Drew, I think next generation tools for advising provide not just data, but contextual insights that really enable humans to have strong impact on student success and student experience. And it's that context that I think adds a ton of value to what it brings.
I'm Sarah Horn, the CEO of ReUp Education, and there is a through line here. Next generation advising is going to be an elegant combination of technology and humanity so that we can provide holistic and personalized support to all learners, traditional, modern, next gen, at scale.
Great, so helpful that there's a through line there. It's a good start, good start. So I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about the current state of the technology offering landscape. So for a long time, there have been conversations about this trade-off that exists between the ability to provide personalized, individualized advising support to students and to provide that type of support at scale. And for equally as long, it feels like there have been conversations about the potential for technology to break that trade-off, right? And to enable the combination of that personalized support delivered at scale. And so the simple question that I have for you all, though I'm sure we'll get into the complexities of it, is how close or how far do you think we are from being able to break that trade-off based on where technology is and based on where the capabilities of institutions are to execute that technology in a way that makes sense? And I'll open up the floor. I kind of want to go to Drew and Sarah first to share their perspectives from the tech provider perspective, but we'll open up the floor if others want to go first.
I think you should.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad to dive in. I actually think we're much closer than ever before. And the trade-off might not be one that's actually a real binary in my estimation. You know, I said it's got to be a purpose-built collaboration between people and technology. So when the technology has the awareness to pass things off to people, but also I think when people have the wherewithal to understand that they can trust a piece of technology to do the work that is actually not the highest leverage opportunity for them to contribute. You know, I was in a conversation just the other day, actually I think with Mark. You mentioned that even if automation can take care of 98% of a conversation, our tool is a AI chatbot, the 1% to 2% is oftentimes the type of thing that takes 50% of a person's time, because it's those deep conversations that you can never simulate with technology. And really, I think our job is to automate away the things that can be automated and find as many of those needles in a haystack so that people who get into this job for the direct purpose of engaging with students can do that face-to-face work and get away from typing endless responses to frequently asked questions on their keyboard. I think we're very close to a realization with the technology, but it's more of frankly, an organizational change and a mindset shift to be able to have trust in both directions, that you can rely on the technology to do its part and the people to do theirs. Curious what you think, Sarah.
I agree with you. It's shocking. No, I do agree with Drew that from a technology perspective, I think we can all see that there's so much great work being done with technology, and in the last couple of decades, the student experience is so much more seamless and better because of various technology implementations that are either driven by companies like Mainstay or ReUp, but I also know in-house at WGU and ASU, there's just amazing work being done. I'm also, sort of a realist and a pragmatist, so my feet are on the ground, and I feel like if it really was sticking the landing in the last 2 decades, we would have seen significant upticks in successful outcomes, of which the outcome movement is not matching the technology implementations that we've seen in the same duration of time. And so when I, look at what's the gap there, I think that I see it in 2 categories. I see how is technology helping personalized support at scale in a transactional way. And then I think about it in the transformational way. And I think on the transactional scale, we're pretty darn close. Like Drew said, you guys have amazing results in sort of, the day-to-day information, back and forth sort of nudges, providing the things that students need that will keep the trains on time. But we also know that if students leave or don't persist, it's because life gets in the way. What are we doing from a technology perspective to really include the insights we have about what's going on and what we know gets in the way, and really providing that transformational support? I think that's where we're chipping away, but we're not there.
So I think I really like this observation that, there's technology and then there's culture. And I think the thing about culture is that in the context of higher education, it is definitely the case that you get what you want, And so I guess the challenge here when we're talking about technologies and integrating technologies into the operations of universities, I think we've been able to identify at least sort of 3 different mindsets, 3 different sort of channels whereby which you get what you want. The first is cool technologies. Like, technology is intrinsically valuable, and we just want cool technologies to do cool things. And the second is, okay, technologies are not intrinsically valuable, they're instrumentally valuable to achieving some kind of objective in the context of scarcity, if it's scarce resources or scarce, whatever, and any sort of form of scarcity. And then the third, which is like the most fringe, is technology is instrumental to the achievement of some kind of goal or objective that we have as a university, our mission as a university, in the context of abundance. And so you can see this playing out in higher education, and I guess the challenge is whether or not the universities, universities are sort of ambitious enough with what it is that they want.
+1 to everything that's been said. One of the things I think certainly the technology has come a long way from the seat that I hold at Western Governors. I think a lot about, even if you have amazing tech, how is it leveraged by the people who need to add that additional value? What are the skills that they have? If they've been successful in their job up to this point because they're really good at process and administrative tasks, then how do we skill them up for truly transformational conversations that provide that space? Shifting away from kind of which courses I should take to transformational learning. And when I think about personalization at scale, I think scale is needed for that personalization, as has already been mentioned. But I also like to think about how, with transformation, the system is actually conforming itself to the needs of the individual rather than the other way around. And I think about that also in terms of the way that the humans provide support, that they're also, conforming is maybe not the right word, adapting. And like the definition of transformational learning is that both the ostensible learner and the ostensible, mentor or instructor are both changing at the same time. And so for us to do that and to be responsive in that way, we're not there yet, but I'm starting to see inklings of it more, and we're really trying to drive in that direction.
A follow-up question on that front, actually. So we talk a lot about the use of next generation technologies to serve students at scale. How do you and Derrick in particular think about the ability to use technology for that upskilling or reskilling of personnel within institutions in a more scaled way, which I think, if I'm picking up on the threads of what you're saying correctly, that's something that's being pursued in a very sort of decentralized way. It's happening institution by institution. What does the future look like for using technology in a way that helps to achieve that sort of upskilling or reskilling in a more scaled way?
Yeah, I think we have to eat our own cooking in some respects, right? And Western Governors is a competency-based institution, so we've been talking a lot about, well, what are the ways that we build those competencies within our people as well? If we're going to be, promoting a skills-based network, we need to be basing our own things on those skills and providing ways for people to build them both in context in the moment, having those supports, as well as the deeper learning, and creating, I would say, communities of practice around this type of work.
What I think is really interesting here, and Sarah, just to clarify, your question's not necessarily upskilling or reskilling the learners, but upskilling or reskilling the team.
That's right.
Yes, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking that. And it's interesting that we have two universities here that have, experimental pedagogically, right? And so we get to sort of taste our own medicine. Yeah, you're right. So physician heal thyself. So we're doing that. So one thing that I really like about this space is that we are seeing, Drew was talking about this recently about how technology is sort of displacing labor displacing jobs. And while it's doing that, it's also creating jobs. And so one thing I'm so excited about at Arizona State University is the proliferation of professions that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. I'm so excited about that. And I think that is where the upskilling or reskilling is going to happen. And so, for example, at Arizona State University, we have more than 150 instructional designers. That didn't even like the term instructional, the profession instructional, and to be clear, it's a profession. The profession instructional designer didn't really exist 10 years ago. Now we have 150. We'll probably have 1,000, before too long. And I think that is part, and many of those instructional designers worked at the university before, and now they're sort of reinventing themselves. And so I think that for us, part of the story here is sort of the creation of new professions and quasi professions, and then also the reinvention of somebody's career in the context of education.
Yeah, I have a thought, if you don't mind my adding it. Technology can be incredibly powerful, but it can also be used unwisely. So when it's, a chatbot put in the corner of a website to answer some questions and forgotten about, it fails to fully maximize the technology. But when it's integrated into the strategy, brought onto a team, and instead of a technology that you're purchasing, it's something you've actually hired and integrated into your workforce, you're actually giving an incredible gift, not just to the students who you'll be serving, but to the staff who have now an AI coworker. A decade from now, we'll all have AI colleagues, and how we coordinate with them and collaborate with them in ways that add value to both parties is going to be essential to our success. And so even in the deliberate implementation of technology, you're giving a gift to your teams and helping them, as you say, adopt new skills for the future without necessarily needing a professional development to do so.
Thank you for that. So I want to continue talking a little bit about the current landscape of technologies in particular and where they're headed. As the landscape evolves, as both of our tech providers on this stage are well aware, especially in student advising and success, we see increasing use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And with that comes a whole host of risks. We see that in particular related to predictive analytics, but also increasingly around tools to support course selection, career support, et cetera. And I think all of us have been in conversations over the last few days, particularly around the risks of racial bias in AI and machine learning, how technology providers should be thinking about mitigating those risks. And so I want to take a slightly different lens to that question in the context of our conversation from the institution perspective to start, which is that, recognizing, as has been discussed in different conversations through this conference, that there's a lot of work to be done around the technology in order to mitigate racial bias and other forms of bias. Derrick, Jennie, maybe to start with your perspectives, how do you think about the processes, the mindsets, the systems that need to be put in place for the people within your teams to make sure that you are actively mitigating that bias and sort of managing around the limitations of the technology that currently exists?
So you go first.
Are you sure? Okay. Okay, so a couple of thoughts there. In terms of mindset, I think we do have to shift some of our mindsets from, and I loved what Derrick said about sort of scarcity or like sort of a deficiency-based mindset to that abundance and what is there. And even sometimes the way we talk about student outcomes, the way that we phrase it, can be reinforcing of those biases. And so I think we have to be very careful about how we talk about the students that need different types of help, for example. There are not at-risk students, right? There are poor performing interventions, right, and supports. Another way that we think about this and that we're building into our work at WGU is looking at learner profiles based on the things that we can impact. Because even though demographic information might be really strongly correlated with certain outcomes, we can't impact that. And so let's hold ourselves accountable to and think about how we're supporting students based on the things that we can take action on, and that helps to mitigate some of that bias. And it also has us thinking about our accountability along the way, rather than just saying, oh well, they were a high-risk student.
So my perspective, I think this is a really great question, and I just want to offer a perspective from sort of a macro level, and it's one that was reflected in Dr. Crow's keynote speech, which so that's part of my collaboration with him involves putting those kinds of things together. And so, what I see here is it's another version of like you get what you want. And so when we build things as a society and as universities, the upside is that they endure, and the downside is that they also endure. And so like what we have today in terms of the sort of the challenges that we have relative to diversity, equity, and inclusion are directly attributable to design choices that we made decades ago that did not prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, and so many of these design choices, so like in Dr. Crow's keynote speech, he talked about how 80 years ago it was just 80 years ago that we put in place, or that World War II happened, and for higher education, that was a massive punctuation in the evolutionary the evolutionary trajectory of higher ed, in the sense that we established the GI Bill and we established resources for higher education, but we didn't prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in those design conversations because like nobody was at that point in time. And now we have this moment today where we have an opportunity, there's a window of opportunity for design, for us to design new institutions, new policies, new practices, new technologies, new tools to adopt, and we can do that in the context of today's culture, which is rapidly changing, to prioritize and to appropriately, I think, if in some contexts, sufficiently appreciate diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so my short, that's a long answer, but my shorter answer is I'm very optimistic because we are building things today in the context and with people who care about these things, and I'm hopeful that will have consequences for decades to come.
Is it okay if I add something? Good fortune smiled upon us in that our earliest partners, particularly Georgia State University, were relentlessly focused on outcomes, first in the big sense of driving the things that matter most in terms of enrollment and persistence, but also measuring all the little processes that are in place. And so for me, it's a gift to be able to rigorously look at what the outcomes are so that you can understand exactly what the impacts are and course correct on a day-to-day basis as well as in a macro scale. I also think that stepping back and understanding, as Sarah noted, that the reason students drop out is oftentimes life getting in the way, and it's so much more than just the bureaucracy at times. Filing paperwork is one thing, and doing so in a timely fashion certainly drives momentum, but also dealing with a flat tire can also be a thing that throws an academic career off track. And so understanding that information is key, but also understanding that equity and empathy are elements that need to be woven into the fabric of any technology product to really connect with people and get them to share what their true struggles are. Building trust starts with a shared sense of support, vulnerability, and we've seen tremendous willingness for people to ask questions and to share what their life circumstances are, particularly in the last year and a half. The sentiments that have poured through the system are profound, jarring at times, but also heartening that people are willing to raise their hand, at least through their smartphone, and say, hey, I could use some help. And I think it's an inkling of what could be things to come as well, and focusing on the outcomes rigorously and seeing what effect you're having every single day is really, I think, the only approach that drives long-term outcomes.
Yeah. I agree with that. My comment, I might be taking us off track on the question, I don't know, but I think where I would push, I agree on the outcomes, where I would push on that, and where I hope we're going is that I fear that because we're so focused on outcomes, we implement something, see how it's going, and then we have to react down the road to realizing we maybe had a flawed plan or made mistakes. What I hope the shift is, what I think the shift is, which I think is somewhat what you're saying, Derrick, is that getting this right requires EDI, DEI, equitable outcomes to be a backbone value, front and center component of everything we do at the beginning from here on out. Everything we design in terms of new technology solutions, everything we implement as an institution, and how we get the multiple stakeholders involved in delivering the solution on board and trusting of not just the technology or the intervention, but the process itself. And I think that's where some of the last 2 decades, if I were to critique it, and I've been a part of this, has kind of gone wrong, is I think we implement solutions almost in a whack-a-mole way, right? Let's put out this fire and this tool can do it, and we need to get this done before the start. And so something's out the door in front of students, in front of faculty, in front of advisors in 90 days. And no one really knows what it's for, how it works, what are the expectations, how does this work within your day-to-day. So from a practical matter, I think that if we are going to move the needle, not just on outcomes in general, but equitable outcomes, we do have to slow down and just be really thoughtful about what we're creating and doing, how we're bringing it into the fold, so that the outcomes that we see and how we react around those aren't so reactionary, right? We have a better sense of what's to come.
There's an abundance of university behaviors that happen in the absence of strategy, and so I mean, you see this all the time. You're probably part of it, and so I think that we have to ask ourselves, I mean, it seems kind of silly, but I mean, everything has to be linked to a purpose, to a mission. If you look at the history of ASU, the tools that we have in the context of this conversation, eAdvisor, for example, eAdvisor is a tool that we built, but we built it after we had sort of, as a university, paused and said, what is our mission? And we reestablished a charter, we adopted the charter, we formalized that charter, and then we started building tools.
+1.
I was just going to say, I think the point about needing to go slow is a really interesting one, and I think it's a good segue to a slightly different question about where institutions should start. So, I mean, obviously we have WGU and ASU on the stage who are incredibly advanced and have very customized approaches to student success and student advising, but there are hundreds, thousands of institutions across the country that are sort of entering this moment with an unprecedented number of technologies available to them. And so I guess the simple question is sort of, where should they start? And I think it would be interesting to get each of your takes on that question and builds, but Jennie, you looked like you were going to say something first.
Yeah, I mean, I would start with the student, right? Understanding what's working for them, what's not, understanding more about their lives, building that empathy from the very beginning, and then centering what you decide to implement first on their needs and your context. I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all per se, other than start with the student.
So I agree. Start with the student. Start with the student. I mean, for ASU, so we have Western Governors and ASU represent two different important pedagogical sort of experiments, and that I think should be appreciated and sort of given some space to continue to evolve. And you're sort of designing this actively, so this is the person to talk to. But I would say, student centricity is key, and then also, the faculty care about students as well, and we need to let them care about students and give them and sort of reward them for caring about students. And so we're seeing at ASU, even though we have, faculty members doing research for spaceships that are going to Mars and things like that. Like we have, a research class faculty. They all care about students as well, and so we're also sort of finding out this balance between, how do we continue to evolve as a scientifically rigorous, research university, and then also, a pedagogically meaningful experiment in the context of American higher education that is student-centric.
You said sometimes it's valuable to go slow. This is a mantra that I have at my company oftentimes, but the why go slow? And for us, it's always trying to get to the core of what is the purpose? What are we aligned around so that we can move fast in the future? And I talked about Georgia State a moment ago. It's worth noting that obviously they've gotten great accolades for the success they've driven, closing the achievement gap and driving great strides, as many other schools have. And from my vantage point, one of the most profound learnings I've had is the mindset that they have around, frankly, growth of themselves. We often talk about growth mindset for students, but really growth mindset is something that we can all embrace. And one of the most profound things they do is look in the mirror, assess where they're making mistakes, and then they celebrate. Because when they found a mistake that they are fully responsible for, it is a moment of joy because they are in full control to fix it. And I think when I've seen the most successful schools at every level of the maturity model, it starts with the mindset and the willingness to say, we're here, we want to be there. We understand where we are in the map, and we are willing to ask for help from our peers and from technology partners to take the next step. And it can be a profound move, and it is incremental. Certainly, you're not going to climb to the mountaintop and be Arizona State overnight. There's so many things in terms of facility with data, organizational alignment, focusing on the student first that need to be in place, but it starts with the mindset that we want to get there and we're willing to look at ourselves in the mirror every single day in order to take the necessary steps. That's been, I think, when I've seen the most successful folks in the industry at every level, that's been a common theme.
Putting the students at the center of the universe, I mean, I think henceforth we can all agree that should be the core of all education-related in decision making. I think it's easy to say that. How do you do it? I think there's a lot of nuance there. We have more data than ever before. I think there's a range of how easy it is to really get at the data and understand it. That I do think is part of this equation, which is we're implementing solutions in most cases based on what the data tells us, how students are progressing, which segments of students are or are not progressing, who's enrolling, who's not. We can see all of that, but if that needs to come to life in a multidimensional way, and I think that we need to push ourselves to understand not just what is the data telling us in a flat file, but like what is the core? What is sort of the root of the thing that's driving success, right? What's the why? And what's also the why where we might see lags where we don't expect it? And I think that we need to, maybe it's going slow, maybe it's really pushing on the data and our understanding, but I do think if we are, as a higher ed community, going to evolve with our ever-evolving students, we need to be thoughtful about the information that we're using to drive our decision-making and the solutions that we bring into the fold.
I want to take a question that Sarah raised and kind of pass it back to Derrick, actually. So I think, I think all of you have raised an important point, which is that at its essence, perhaps in a counterintuitive way, Next Generation is really about this simple concept of putting the student at the center, really determining then how to bring in technology and the people surrounding the student to support that student's experience and success at kind of its core, its root. And I think Sarah brought up a good question, which is, that sounds great, but how do you actually action that in a practical way? And so I'm looking at you, Derrick, from the ASU perspective in particular, because I know we've talked previously about the evolution the university has had around really moving towards being a more student-centric institution. And so I'm curious if there's a couple kind of more practical nuggets that you could share about where that process started that might be relevant to others.
Yeah, so I'm a professor, and I'm not going to apologize for what's about to happen. So when we decided years ago that we were going to massify education, we adopted what I would call bureaucratic organizational logics, which are defined in part by their sort of prioritization of utilitarianism, meaning that they are designed in order to do the greatest good for the greatest number, and not the greatest good for all. And so as universities, we conscientiously chose and we adopted massification models that neglected massive numbers of learners, typically at the tail ends of the distribution. So step one is reject that. So tell yourself, design as an institution a model that's going to engage all learners. In order to do that, step two, I think, is to, and these are kind of like, these co-occur iteratively back and forth. Step two is design systems and experiences, at the macro level and at the individual level, that reject the notion of learner deficiency. So learner deficit modeling has to be done. Like, there are no deficient learners. In fact, I would argue that the bureaucratization of education introduced the idea that there are deficient learners because it was an expedient way to get rid of the learners that are beyond 1.5 standard deviations from the mean, And so they're like, listen, we're going to give you a 504 plan, we're going to give you an IEP, because it removes from us the burden of actually having to deal with you, and we're going to invent these things called disabilities, and we're going to remove from schools the burden of actually having to attend to all learners and all needs. So get rid of learner deficit modeling and all of its disastrous consequences, and recognize that the only thing that's broken in education are the learning institutions themselves, the teachers and the institutions themselves, and then start fixing based on that assumption. And then you'll have a lot of work to do.
Anything else to add to that, Jennie, from your perspective?
So I definitely agree with with where we've come from in higher education in terms of who was it built for, to begin with, and what it was meant to produce, and I love the idea of like, it's very much growth mindset. It's very much every learner can learn, and that we learn from them, right? That when we take on that challenge to reject deficits, right, deficit modeling, and instead think to ourselves, if if this learner is struggling, we get to learn from them about how we get to be better. And it is a lot of work, but it is, I would say, such an invitation, and something where, as a community, we can continue to learn from each other and find incredible value from what we're learning in our various contexts, so that we can address the needs of each unique individual learner, because there is no one size fits all. And that's, I mean, I know that's something that we all know, but then putting it into practice and doing it in a collaborative way is, there's a lot of growth for us there.
Can I add something quick? One thing that we've seen with our platform, which allows a school to have a one-to-one conversation with every student every day, 24 hours a day, is that it's not just about answering questions, about asking the right questions of an audience. And if you want to know what is on the minds of your students, they are very eager to tell you. And simply asking the right question can unlock a flood of insight to precisely understand where there might be gaps and opportunities. And I think one of the things, because it's never been possible to listen at the tremendous scale, the typical ways we've done this are by email surveys, which get a 1% to 2% response rate. But if you can truly use a tool like ours, potentially, to have this conversation and get the feedback from an entire student body at once, it can be a profound eye-opening experience, I think, to enlist perhaps the largest untapped resource on any campus, which are the students themselves.
So we've talked a lot about the aspiration for a next generation model of student advising and student success, what it might take to get there. I'm curious, Sarah and Drew, for your perspectives in particular on the biggest mistakes that you see institutions make. Drew, you kind of hinted at this earlier when you talked about this like disaggregation or divorced implementation of tech from people, but just curious in our last few minutes if there are others that come to mind.
I'm going to say something. So I think that, what Derrick and Jennie said, it kind of inspiring me, this idea of sort of deconstructing the whole higher ed or institutional structure, which I passionately agree with. I think this is about a mindset shift. Like the work that we do at ReUp is squarely focused on helping, non-traditional learners who they're never going to complete while being active for every month of 4 years in a row. And when I take a step back and think about myself, and if I have a goal, a 4-year goal or plan, the likelihood that that goal and plan is going to be achieved in a linear way without issue or roadblocks, it is a 0% chance. And I'm sure that problem is most likely the same for all of us up here on the panel and in the audience. And so I think that higher ed needs a mindset shift, a very important, just fundamental mindset shift, to realize that the learner experience, it's highly unlikely it's going to be linear. In fact, 50% of the learners at some point are going to be inactive. They're going to stop out. It's going to maybe be a summer. It's going to be a few months. It could be years. It's our imperative to find a way to support and educate the learners until they reach their goal. So I don't think we've designed the experience with that in mind, with that front and center. And I think we need to shift to being very realistic about that.
Yeah, similarly, a lot of schools buy technology products. I think that's oftentimes a fool's errand. You should buy outcomes or demand outcomes and buy solutions to those outcomes and truly enlist tech partners. Vendors are anathema. We need to be really in the mix, in the mess together. And I think together we can come up with better solutions. Jury word, yeah.
All right, we've got about a minute left, so I'm gonna take us through to a rapid fire round robin question. Thinking about the future of advising and student success, 5 words, 10 seconds or less, what comes to mind for each of you when you think about what that future could look like?
I would say a partnership of technology and humans that is deliberately developmental for both the learners and the institution.
I think the relationship that begins freshman year and never ends for a student's life. between the institutions themselves?
I'd say every learner engaged in the pursuit of his or her own self-defined learning journey.
Seeing the learner as a whole student and human, recognizing that most of their experience happens outside of the classroom, and how we support them is outside is as important as inside.
Great. Well, ending with 7 seconds to spare. Derrick, were you going to say something?
4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much to our great panelists.